shit that you can't see, cause you can find it, homes, is that you don't want to. You cope by putting the blinders on. I've been trying to find some kind of way, but I've kind of known that y'all would rather whine and lash to nonsense cause your mind is gone.
Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Staley from Diverge Media here with Mattea Merta.
Absolutely. So at Vote Family, we're a national Canadian organization that helps Canadians truly vote family in favor of the fundamental family. And so we highlight issues around cultural issues, different political candidates and legislation, so that when you end up at that ballot box, you know who you're voting for, whether they're in favor of the family or they're going to end up attacking it with policies and legislation. I'm also an NGO representative at the United Nations. I do not work with the United Nations. I actually go against their anti-family, anti-national sovereignty narrative. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. I worked on Parliament Hill previous and with a cabinet minister in the province of Saskatchewan, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight.
So you've done a few things, just to clarify.
A few things.
You're quite the record, and I think some valuable experience to talk about the family in regards to the COVID narrative. So we were talking a little bit before we started here, but I just want to start with this tweet. I guess we'll do from there and kind of get your thoughts. You say attacks on the family are intentional. Systematically, policies have been implemented under the guise of equality, equity, sustainability, and fairness, but the real objectives are to demoralize the family, strip it of its role, and replace it with a bloated governing system. You say attacking the patriarchy is meant to distort the value of men in society. Men's masculinity is labeled as toxic, and therefore meant to drive down any desirability of developing it in a healthful manner while demeaning the essential roles men have in the home. So in regards to COVID, we touched on this a little bit off, but I think we're seeing a lot of the problems that have been in the system for quite some time, kind of rearing their ugly head at home and dividing families. And we're not really seeing a lot of help out of a government on the federal or provincial level, trying to unite people and especially the family. Instead, it seems like there's an intention to divide. And we'll just get your thoughts from there and we'll continue.
Yeah, for sure. So that is something I've gotten so many emails, text messages, and phone calls about this issue of families being divided with regards to the COVID issue. And generally, as someone who's worked on Parliament Hill with a cabinet minister, I know that if there is a legitimate threat to public health and safety, generally that government is going to want to quell the fear of the people so that they can move forward and that they can walk through that threat. Now, what we're seeing through all of our Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds and every other kind of feed out there is the government and the paid off media in Canada continually stoking fear into the hearts and minds of people. And there was actually a La France article that came out that stated that children age 11 and younger were coming home from school and they're presented with anxiety and depression because they are so scared of passing on this spooky virus to their family members, their parents and their grandparents. And this is driving a divisionary line between parents even and their children. And that's something that should not be happening. And it's really sad to see, but we're also seeing a lot of fear within the general populace at large in all age groups. And that's really disturbing to see. The government is not doing its job. If this is a legitimate threat, they should be quelling that fear. And at the moment, they're only providing one solution, which is their solution. And that is something that is really scary because it's just one injection or two injections. And now we have 3 or 4 or 5 because we're facing now, I just read a headline that in Saskatchewan, we're facing a 5th wave now. So you better, all you unvaccinated Canadians, follow the government. Do not, it's almost like we essentially do not have any bodily autonomy anymore. God-given rights and freedoms are being stripped away from us, and it's a continual chipping continually away from those fundamental values that we all supposedly have. The government doesn't recognize them, but they are God-given and they're not being acknowledged at this point. So that's really scary.
I think the importance of that God-given rights is important to remember, because if our rights don't come from God, and I remember you don't even need to believe in God to understand this. I remember being explained by a law professor that if we're going to, we think about the law, the reason these rights come from God, and the reason they come from God is so that the government can't decide what the rights are. With this kind of division going on, is what's your take as an NGO to advocate at the United Nations for God-given rights?
So Vote Family is not at the United Nations. I'm actually with another NGO.
Okay.
It's a totally separate NGO. But what we see as very, very sketchy is the fact that national sovereignty is being stripped away, or at least not acknowledged. The right of nations to have self-determination, make their own laws and policies, and not be coerced into any other globalist institutional decisions, or be pressured to follow in line with any kind of mandates or recommendations those globalist institutions would so desire. But also with regards to advocating at the UN, there's so many things going on. I mean, we could spend hours on that topic alone, but the big issue right now is Agenda 2030.
Yeah.
And the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are all enveloped. You have to, I believe it's 193 countries present at the United Nations who have signed on to Agenda 2030. And so therefore they have an obligation to follow suit with, implementing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals into national legislation. So for anybody who doesn't know, the United Nations is not an elected body. Bureaucrats are sent there, to advocate for national, the best, what is the right word? Recourse for national policy with regards to the respective nations. So the UN essentially puts out mandates or policies of their own, and all these nations fall in line with those policies. And so that's really scary, because we represent here in Canada, we elect our representatives. And then they start taking orders from the United Nations or the WHO or UNICEF or UNDP or whoever it might be. And these individuals do not have national sovereignty. That is not their best interest, because their best interest is to continue flourishing in their own way, which they're beholding primarily to philanthropists or to nations like Canada, like France, like others, who do not have family values at the core of their national policies or their organization's policies. And I'm thinking of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, amongst others, like Planned Parenthood, who really do not value the fundamental family and the role that it has within society. Instead, they want to see it deteriorate, because, again, the whole point is to elevate different governing structures higher than the value of the family in nations. So we see national sovereignty and the fundamental family continually attacked at the UN, and that's why we're there to prevent that, or at least hold it back.
It does seem, and I've studied like the World Economic Forum, UN Agenda 2030, 2050, net zero. Yeah. It seems like a lot of, I've always talked about it, there's like a grain of truth, because you can't convince people on absolute nonsense. So there's a grain of truth that ties it through. Like, maybe we are using too many resources too quickly, and maybe we need to be better stewards of the earth and the land. But then I always say, but why is it always usurp liberty, freedom, national sovereignty, things like this? It's always in the name of the greater good. Yeah. But when we think of, even not many people are aware, but the World Economic Forum wrote the book, The Great Reset, Klaus Schwab, the founder. Klaus
Schwab, yep.
And Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland sits on the board of trustees at the World Economic Forum. It's not as though this is a handful of people. Michelle Rempel was part of the Young Global Leaders, which is a spider web attached to that organization. And most recently, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is talking about, it's encompassing a number of financial institutions, over 450 major financial institutions, including BlackRock. Michael Bloomberg is a part of that. Mark Carney is heading that. And it's 130 trillion, I believe, in assets they're representing. And they're talking about going after the oil. And basically all these things stem down to, it's not working the way things are currently stated within the countries. And we need outside influences that know better to kind of tell these countries what to do. But I think at the basis of that, and I think what's so valuable about what you do is, yes, the family is where the conversations start. It's where those values are developed. But I want to go back and circle back. It feels like we're not teaching our kids now to think for themselves, but rather we're telling them what to think and what tribe to belong to. And I just want to get your thoughts as a rep talking to the United Nations, who's running many of the initiatives, I believe, that are creeping into the school systems and things like that, what your viewpoint is on that, because I think the importance of being able to stand on your own, and we don't raise kids to go along with the flow, but hopefully we're raising kids to be able to stand independently against the grain and think independently when the time calls for it. And there's a time and a place. Yep. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I just want to say to any parents, whether at present or in future, that are watching this, thank you for investing in your kids, because I know you yourself have 4 children, and I say kudos to you and your wife. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, and it is an investment to have a family, and a good one at that. And the work that you do in your home is so, so valuable. But most often it is undermined by government-run institutions like the public school system, where they're actively teaching your children, primarily in Canada, socialistic ideals, whether it comes to their CRT in their math classes, which is critical race theory. So in my world, I use a lot of acronyms, whether it's at the UN or in government, it's all acronyms. And we also see a lot of what we call CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, which is intimately now linked to critical race theory and the implementation of it in our kids' school systems. And both of those things highly undermine fundamental family values. And a lot of it is stemmed from the United Nations. For example, comprehensive sexuality education, the universal standard for that type of curriculum, was written, drafted, and implemented by the United Nations and its sister branches. And one of the really creepy things, for example, in Europe, because it's all delegated, whether it's Europe, a European standard, or a North American standard, whatever it may be, the European standard of CSE coming out of the UN, that states that 0 to 4-year-olds need to be taught about masturbation and touching themselves in school, in kindergarten, in childcare facilities. So this is really creepy, and most parents aren't aware that their child, because, for example, my parents went to school, they got a sex ed program, and then they think that that's going to be the same sex ed program that their child is going to be exposed to and learn from, primarily biology based, not a lot of bias, not a lot of the woke indoctrination that we're seeing in the general population or in culture in general. But what their kids are facing is that very thing, the transgender agenda. It's a lot of undermining parental rights and even speaking against parents. It's asking questions, both CRT and CSE, get children to question the values and beliefs, the thought patterns that their parents teach them in the home, and present them with a different way of thinking. And so children are often, it's peer pressure. They see the majority of kids are listening intently. And so they start to adopt these ideologies. And that's really what they are, instead of just solely being given true education, which is not influenced by personal biases or opinions. But that's the reality of what our kids face. So they come home, and parents, when they see their children going off to college, university, they go, "Oh my gosh, who are you? We didn't raise you this way." It's because the school system has indoctrinated them. And you start to see apps. CBC News, for example, has a whole child section now where they're pushing the COVID narrative, amongst other things that are really quite sketchy. And so children are not only being presented with this kind of indoctrination in their school, in their classroom, but they're also getting it on their phones, on TV, and elsewhere.
So how do you overcome that from your perspective? Because I've wrestled with this as a father. Is if you're working full time, and you don't have the option to homeschool, sometimes it's just not a possibility. How do you get your values to come across in the home? Because I might have, I'll be honest, when I get home from work after doing my full-time job, I have an hour and a half, 2 hours with my kids. If they were going to school, they would have 7-8 hours there. And the values that they're teaching there, even if they love dad and they think I'm awesome and great, they're getting 3 to 4 times more time with someone else's values than they are with mine. So what's your perspective, and how do you advocate for the values that are important to you in the home with your kids? How do you have those hard conversations while they're still influenceable, I think, is another important one, because I've heard this time and time again. I know people personally where, yes, they end up with almost fistfights with mom and dad because a lot of the education they have is completely counter to the values that they've been taught, and to the point where they think mom and dad are bad people.
Yeah. Yeah. I know many people, the exact situation you just explained. I know many of them. And it is kind of heartbreaking, but there are indeed things that you can do. The one thing that I always advocate for are family dinners. And it seems so practical and sometimes so menial, but the practical and the menial are super important. Because that's a centralized place where everybody comes together, everybody can sit down, and you ask them questions. For me, that was probably the most impactful thing. I hated it as a kid, but I realized the importance of it because I not only got to hear what was going on in my brothers' lives and in my parents' lives, but I got to share also. And so that's one way that you can gain information from your kids. Also watching what they're watching and what their activity is online. That's so critical because you can't necessarily be in the classroom with your children, hearing what they're hearing, but you can absolutely have control over what they see and hear online. And that's a whole other essentially education that children are getting. So whether it's not necessarily censoring your children, but censoring your children, I say go for it. If your children are in your home, you have a right to know what they're doing with their time in your home. Another thing you can do is understand what they are learning in their classrooms, because that is critical. You have every right as a parent, a mom and dad, to go to your child's teachers and find out exactly what curriculum they are teaching. You have every right. Now, I know some parents who have done this and have been denied their right to see what their children are learning. And at that point, it's a major red flag. Major red flag. So you take it to the higher ups, and if you still can't see, you yank your kids from that school. You have to. There has to be sacrifices made. I know many parents who have made sacrifices where the mother has chosen to stay home from her job and not send her children to, for example, to childcare or to daycare, so that they're not paying that bill, so she can stay home with the children until they find a new school for those kids to go to. So there's always a way to look into what your kids are doing or learning. But really, at the end of the day, it's seeking out the heart of your child. It's seeking to understand what your child is going through. And I think that's a big disconnect, something that we're not seeing in society very much anymore, because of how busy we all are. And I think that's one of the silver linings of this whole COVID era. I hate using that, but it's really what it is now, unfortunately. But it's forced everybody to reprioritize what is really important to them. And family, at the end of the day, is not only important to you, but it's important to society. It's important to your community, because strong families build strong nations. And so seeking out the heart of your child to understand where they're at and to listen is so important. So at the end of the day, that's really where it's at.
It ain't that you can't see, cause you can find it, Holmes. It's that you don't want to. You cope by putting the blinders on. I've been trying to find some kind of way, but I've kind of known that y'all